Here's a review of the important topics of the respiratory system. We'll cover the main anatomical structures and brief functions of those structures, and of course, how those structures help us to exchange the important gases, where we're going to take oxygen in and get rid of CO2. Oxygen that's essential for every living cell in your body. So here's a nice diagram of those structures that are part of the respiratory system that, of course, works in conjunction with our cardiovascular system to make sure those gases get to your cells. Specifically, oxygen comes in, and then CO2 is released, which, of course, CO2 represents a byproduct of metabolism, and it is a waste product that we need to get rid of. As we look at the structures in this sketch, you can see that there are two main divisions of your respiratory system: upper respiratory structures and passageways, and lower respiratory structures and passageways. And most of you have heard of someone having an upper respiratory infection versus a lower respiratory infection. And you can see how those would be designated. So let's go through the process of naming these passageways and structures as the air would be coming into your system. And then, of course, we reverse those structures to have the CO2 leaving the system. So the nose, remember, is designed and structured to bring air in, as opposed to the mouth. You're not usually to breathe through your mouth. While we can, the nose is designed for that initial airflow to come in. The pharynx, we're going to see, is oftentimes referred to as the throat. And we know we share the pharynx, the throat, with the digestive system in that both food and air goes through the pharynx. The larynx is our traditionally known as your voice box. That's the top of on top of the trachea, which is traditionally known as your windpipe. That's followed by the bronchus on the right and another bronchus on the left. They're known as primary bronchi. So it's the branches, those are the branches off the trachea. Those go to smaller structures called bronchioles that become smaller and smaller and smaller, and finally get to the lung proper. The lung is going to be made of millions of these tiny air sacs that we call alveoli. Alveolus is one, alveoli are plural, and they're these tiny air sacs that are in groups. I'm going to try to draw it kind of like a little grapes on a stem. And those alveoli that are, again, millions of them making up your lung, the three-dimensional nature of your lung, that's where you're going to have the air exchange. And remember, we want O2 to come out. This is the overview. We're going to feed our cells as that oxygen gets into circulation. And then CO2, which is being made by all living cells as a waste product, a byproduct of metabolism, we're going to get that CO2 in to these, again, alveoli. Alveoli. Alveolus is singular, alveoli is plural. Let's take a moment to look at these structures of the upper respiratory tract. So nose, pharynx, and larynx, and you can see what would be considered a sagittal section right through the head, down the middle, and how these structures are related. So the nose, of course, has the opening that traditionally known as nostrils or nares, external nares. Your nose is designed more for air and not food because of the hairs and the mucus present. It's going to help filter the air. In addition to filtering, the air that comes in, we want to become moistened and warmed, and that's going to improve the way that we exchange the gases, the oxygen in and the CO2 out. Of course, we have ways to identify smells, and there are specific odor receptors. Later on, when we study senses, we'll see that those are called olfactory receptors, olfactory cells. And then we do have a connection of the nose to the eye, specifically your tear glands that are up on the outside of your eye, again, that we'll study in the senses chapter. Those tears drain across your eye and down into the nasal cavity. Hence, when you have a big cry, you will end up with increased secretions in your nose. Here's a picture of a cross-section of a cadaver where you're seeing the nasal cavity, and specifically well, what we're mentioning as the olfactory epithelium is going to be the lining inside the nose. And you've got some structures in there called concha that really help make the air more turbulent, and we can filter and warm the air more easily. This is the hard palate here that we mentioned with digestive system. So that's bony structure, soft palate there. And then remember the uvula, if you look in someone's mouth, that's hanging down the back. That helps with our initiation of the swallowing reflex. So the pharynx, also commonly known as the throat. We know there's an area right behind the nose, a pharynx behind your mouth, and a pharynx that's near the voice box. So those are listed here: nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. The important thing to understand is this one throat or tube that is also the oropharynx in particular, shared with the digestive system. We'll also have tonsils associated with that space. Tonsils are part of your lymphatic system, which is going to house your immune cells. And then those are there as air comes in to identify microbes. And here's a picture of some of those tonsils. You actually have 3 different categories of tonsils. Not important that you can identify those 3, but understand they exist here in the nasal cavity, and then over here in the oropharynx in the back of your throat. Here's what you would see if you look into somebody's mouth and you are wondering, do they still have their tonsils? You can see them here. I'm going to outline it over here. They're kind of here to the lateral side of each side of the oral cavity. And those are a particular kind of tonsil you call your palatine tonsil. Here you can see them here, kind of cut open and embedded in the soft tissue that's in the back of your throat, the base of the tongue. But also, again, if you go back to the visual here, if someone still has these tonsils, they haven't been removed, you'd see them here. And when they're infected, they can swell out pretty far. Yeah, so I remember my daughter having them so large that they were almost touching the uvula. So here's the uvula, circle it there. That's the punching bag hanging down in the back, and then the tonsils lateral to that. And the third structure, part of this upper respiratory tract, is known as the larynx, So in these pictures here, there's actually a camera looking down into the space where the larynx is actually the top of the trachea, your windpipe. And we know, of course, this is traditionally known as your voice box. So there are cartilages, as it's mentioned here, those are going to help keep the shape of it, or the box. And it's resting there between your pharynx, your throat, and your windpipe, the trachea. So here we're seeing vocal cords that are flanking or surrounding a space. The space itself is called the glottis. And so air, of course, is going to go in and out of this. So the voice box and the vocal cords are really working together to help create vocalizations that are typically human vocalizations. So let's think about, as these folds move in and out, that's going to help make up the noise or the sounds that we make. Those vocal cords are surrounding the space. As I mentioned, the space is known as the glottis. So then sitting on top of our overarching that space is a structure known as the epiglottis. In this picture, we can see that the structure known as the epiglottis, I'm going to point to it right here, That is located so that when you swallow food, that epiglottis folds over and is protecting the trachea. So we know that's our windpipe, and we need air only going down the trachea. When you swallow something, when you swallow food, we want the food going behind the trachea, right? We want it to go down the esophagus. So that's the role of the epiglottis. As we think about what helps change the tone of our voice, whether we're singing, shouting, speaking, whispering, as we adjust the distance here between the vocal cords, you're going to have a different sound. So higher pitches are going to have these vocal cords that are tighter, right? They're going to be closer together, and you end up with a high pitched sound. And lower tones, lower sounds, you're going to have those vocal cords that are more open, like this. And of course, both the force of air coming out because of your exhalation as you breathe out, that's going to change the sound as well, and the sound of the box itself, right? That box, that voice box that's created by the cartilage in that space. So again, high-pitched sounds are what you will hear when those vocal cords are closer together and air moves through the vocal cords and gives you a high-pitched sound. And then when they're more open, lower pitched, and then you might think, well, when I have laryngitis, I have an inflammation of this part of my body. That's going to affect the sounds that I make, what my voice sounds like. Let's continue on to the structures known to be part of the lower respiratory tract. So the trachea, the windpipe, the bronchial tree. So here you've got your windpipe, and then it's like an upside down tree, right? So then it branches, and those are known as bronchi, the very first branches. And then lots and lots of branches beyond that. These are still the tubes, the passageways for air. And then the lung proper, the lung tissue itself is made of these alveoli, the air sacs. That's where you actually have the gas exchange, oxygen in and CO2 out. When we look at the interior of the trachea, the lining of your windpipe, which you can feel to be having rings on it when you touch the anterior surface of your trachea. So that the lining of the trachea, also known as windpipe, is going to have a lot of these structures known as cilia. They're on the surface of the cells there. In addition, we'll have structures or unique cells known as goblet cells. The rings that are there, these cartilaginous rings, help keep the windpipe open because, of course, we don't want the trachea or windpipe to collapse. The cilia will move and beat in a way that helps those particles that we may breathe in to be moved up in conjunction with the mucus. And mucus is what is being produced by the goblet cells. So here's a really important role for these cells. And of course, if you have something stuck in your throat, MUCUS, I think it's actually supposed to be CUOS. Anyway, that's going to help remove the particles that might be stuck there in your, or hanging out in your respiratory tract. As I mentioned, the trachea will branch. And so we'll refer to all these branches as the bronchial tree. So trachea branches into two main bronchi, that would be plural. So trachea, they branch to bronchi, goes into the lung proper. And as those passageways continue to branch more and more, they become smaller and smaller, as small as generally at 1 millimeter. So that's pretty tiny. And as they are getting to the lung proper, we're going to see these very small air sacs called alveoli. So eventually leading to alveolar sacs and these individual, as I mentioned before, individual little balloon-like things. And that's where the actual exchange happens for the respiratory system. So what do we actually consider the lungs? We would think about once the trachea has branched to become bronchi. The bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli are really making up the right lung and the left lung. The trachea meeting those lungs. The right lung only has, excuse me, not only, but has 3 lobes, and the left lung has 2 lobes. You might remember that the heart is a little displaced to the left. And so we're seeing that the left lung has 2 lobes and the right lung has 3. There is a covering over those lungs. So as we consider in a few minutes, when we think about the 2 lungs that exist, and as I mentioned, the right lung having 3 lobes, the left having 2, covering those lungs is a very important membrane known as the pleura. And so I'm going to draw it here. So covering the lung with a little bit of space. And these are going to be completely separate coverings. So the right lung and the left lung have their own coverings or pleura. And those coverings are going to help create what we're going to call a negative pressure so that air flows in and then is pushed out in our process of the respiratory cycle. Remember, making up the density of the lung, the 3-dimensionality of the lung, are these many millions of alveoli. So those are the small air sacs. When we consider pulling them apart and seeing them individually, here's a bronchiole, or that smallest passageway leading to the groups of structures that we call alveoli. Alveolus is one. You can see you're going to have many, many blood vessels that are bringing low oxygenated blood and high in CO2, bringing that blood to those little air sacs and then exchanging CO2 out and oxygen into the blood, so that when the blood leaves, we're going to have not as much CO2, but a lot of oxygen, because we know oxygenated blood turns red. So this is going to be leaving out to take that freshly oxygenated blood to the body. So millions of them, 300 million in the lungs. You have a lot of surface area for air exchange. We know there are a lot of capillaries that cover those little air sacs called alveoli. And again, the purpose to allow for the exchange of gases. There's a substance known as surfactant. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but understand that surfactant lines the interior of these air sacs. Surfactant is a special chemical that really acts like a detergent in a way, and it's going to help keep these air sacs open. All right, so water surface tension doesn't collapse the little balloons, little air sacs. Surfactant keeps that open. So premature infants will oftentimes not have enough surfactant, so the alveoli are not staying open. So if you have decreased amount of surfactant, it is likely that the air sacs may collapse. Looking briefly at the 2 phases of breathing, simply air in, air out. Notice some words that are synonymous here. The process of inspiration is active. Inspiration is active. We have to have muscle contraction that ends up making the space bigger and draws air in. Inspiration is synonymous with inhalation, or to bring in the air into the lungs. Expiration is to push out the air. And if we are having restful breathing, that's going to be a passive process. Unless you are forcing air out, whether it's coughing, trying to breathe more heavily in exercise, then you might be using some muscles. But normally, that's going to be a passive process. We relax, diaphragm comes up, air goes out. So notice expiration is also referred to as exhalation, to expel the air. Inhalation into the lungs, exhalation to expel the air, push it out. Let's take a quick look visually at what is going on with the thoracic cage. So I'm going to point out here the main thing, and again, always in breathing, diaphragm is involved with breathing, bringing air in and then pushing it out. When it is actively contracting, the diaphragm is pushed downward. So think about what happens to your chest space. Your thoracic cavity gets bigger. All right, you'll have some other muscles called intercostal muscles. They also help get the chest cavity or the thoracic cavity to be bigger. So the steps involved, the muscles involved, diaphragm and intercostal muscles, especially the diaphragm. So just remember, when it contracts, down it goes, flattens out, and the space is going to become larger. Diaphragm flattens, rib cage moves upward and outward. All right, so that's what's shown here. And because it gets bigger, you're going to now have bigger space, which is less pressure than what's out here. So that's going to act like a vacuum and bring in the air. So overall, again, volume or the space is getting bigger, which means the pressure goes down. So because of that, airflow direction is in. As soon as you make your chest bigger, air is going to come in because of this vacuum-like pressure situation that we've created. When we're looking at expiration, just reverse that. So of course, expiration to exhale and to push the air out. So we need the rib cage to become smaller. So the diaphragm is relaxing. When a diaphragm relaxes, it actually moves up and becomes more dome-like. You see this dome-like shape there. So that's when we relax, air goes out. So with those muscles relaxing, we know what's happened to the shape of the diaphragm. It's become dome-like. We know the rib cage coming down and moving inward makes the space smaller. So the volume decreases. So when you push the volume down, and you can see rib cage moving down and in, then in fact, the pressure inside that space is going to increase. You're pushing the air closer together. When pressure in the lungs increases, the air is pushed out, right? So squeeze it, push the air out. So that's the principle of both inspiration, make the space bigger, pressure down, in comes the air. Expiration, make the space smaller, pressure goes up, forces the air out. And those are the two events of what we call the respiratory cycle. A quick note about regulation or control of the breathing cycle. Up in your brainstem, there's a respiratory center, region of the brain that automatically regulates breathing, right? We don't have to tell ourselves to breathe. It's going to happen automatically. We can adjust our breathing. We can hold our breath. We can breathe faster by the brain giving information to the brain stem and saying, we're going to adjust the breathing rate. But overall, there is this automatic regulation through the brain stem. And that control center in the brain is in an area called the medulla or the medulla oblongata. So again, regulation starts in the brain. We have an example where regulation seems to stop, and that is with something called SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. So if the impulses are not being sent, so those nerve signals not reaching the area that needs to, those muscles that need to contract. Remember the muscles involved, diaphragm. With the breath in, the diaphragm is going to be flattening out and moving downward. Those intercostal muscles are going to move. So if the nerves going to those muscles don't send a message, there won't be a breath initiated by the nervous system. Hence what is happening with SIDS or sudden infant death syndrome. There is a feedback. You may remember, of course, our theme of homeostasis, keeping things in balance. So we have to make sure the chemicals in our blood are controlled, and breathing will help do that. So breathing chemically controlled is through receptors we call chemoreceptors. So they're part of your nervous system. They're sensitive to changes in pH. They're sensitive to changes in carbon dioxide. So when you have a drop in pH, we know the blood is becoming more acidic. One of the reasons why blood becomes more acidic is when you have increased CO2. You're not going to have to recognize the equation, but increased CO2 converts to carbonic acid. Acids drop the pH. So the combination of these changes would initiate breathing. And when pH goes up and CO2 goes down, that would slow down the breathing. So these are chemical controls through the receptors we call chemoreceptors, sensitive to pH and carbon dioxide for the most part. I want to point out that the process of bringing air in, inspiration, pushing air out, expiration, we call that whole process ventilation, breathing or ventilation. So to vent something like your air vents, your air conditioning vents, we're allowing the passage of air from one space to another. So that word is known as ventilation. We're going to compare that to a word called respiration. Respiration, which happens both at the lung surface and then down in your tissues. First, we consider the respiration or the exchange of gases, that's respiration, to be external when it's between the lung cells, those little air sacs, the alveoli. So between the alveoli and the capillaries that are hovering around the alveoli. So remember, CO2 is coming from the blood into the air sac, the alveoli, oxygen's coming from inside the air sac to the blood. That's external respiration. Compare that then to internal respiration. Respiration still exchange of gases. But when we're talking about the movement specifically from the blood capillaries to the tissue fluid, going into that space where all of our living cells are so that we can deliver oxygen, that's internal respiration. This figure in your textbook, I think, is a really good overview of those two processes. So external respiration up here at the surface of the lung and the capillary. So with external respiration, what do we want to happen? We know we want to take our CO2, and you can see it's landing in an alveolus, an air sac. Remember, these are the air sacs that are making up the majority of the three-dimensionality of the lung. CO2 is going to leave. We also are going to pick up oxygen. So this is inside an air sac here again, but we're looking at this air sac having some oxygen that came in. You breathed it in. We want it to move into the red blood cells, be carried on hemoglobin. And of course, that's when it leaves the lung and arrives to the heart. So at the lung surface, external respiration. We get down into the tissues all over the body because the heart has pumped that fresh oxygenated blood out to all the body cells. So you can see down here, what's the goal again? We're going to get that oxygen to move from your red blood cells, hitched a ride on hemoglobin, get it into the tissues. So oxygen's getting into these cells, right? We need all of our cells to have oxygen or those cells will die. At the same time, cells are making carbon dioxide. So here's the CO2 that was made by any cell that's living, and that's going to hop a ride in the red blood cell. And a little bit is located in the plasma, but the point is your CO2 that's made here, that CO2 needs to get out. So up it goes, it's going to travel to the heart, and then we have finished our internal respiration down in the tissues, between tissues and capillaries. And those are that's the difference of those two processes helping to exchange gases. Let's take a moment to look at a few common upper respiratory tract infections. Someone's diagnosed with having upper respiratory tract infections. You think of sinuses. So sinuses, of course, exist in your head. You've got front sinus, maxillary sinus, two sinuses that are very deep, and that blockage is sinusitis, a sinus infection. Itis, remember, referring to infection and swelling or inflammation. A middle ear infection, otitis media, and we put it here as a upper respiratory tract infection because the fluids have gone from your nasal cavity to your middle ear and are infected. So it's otitis media. Tonsillitis, again, we see itis, inflammation of the tonsils. Now you've seen that there are actually three different tonsils, three names for or groups of tonsils, but any of those we're going to consider tonsillitis. Laryngitis, look at the root there, the larynx. So of course, that's when your voice box is swollen, inflamed, and may change the sound of your voice. So those are upper respiratory tract infections. Lower respiratory tract infections would be then below the larynx. So the common disorder or infection known as pneumonia, we know has to do with fluid buildup. So there are multiple reasons to have pneumonia, bacterial infection, of course, viral infection. When you end up with this fluid buildup, those air sacs, remember, that need to be open to exchange air. Well, if those are full of fluid, they're not going to exchange air well. So fluid buildup there can be heard by the clinician, and they listen to the lungs. And then when they hear a particular type of sound, they know that there's fluid increase. Tuberculosis is specifically due to a bacterial infection that creates these structures known as tubercles. So that's why it's known as tuberculosis. Of course, we have vaccinations that help ward off tuberculosis. And although it is a pretty prominent disease in many countries across the world because of that lack of protection through our vaccines. Tuberculosis, again, creating tubercles, the bacterial infection specifically that causes that. Pulmonary fibrosis is exactly as it's described. You end up with fibrous lung. And fibrous lungs can expand and contract. So with that connective tissue or fiber buildup, you really are not able to exchange air very well. Oftentimes it's because of particles that have been inhaled and then really the exchange tissue of the lung has been removed or has become connective tissue, not respiratory tissue. Emphysema, again, not able to exchange gas easily in the alveoli. This due to the surface area changing and becoming less elastic, really. And so with that, again, if you have emphysema developed, whether it's from environmental exposure at work or from smoking for many, many years, the alveoli are damaged and that surface area is not exchanging air very well. With asthma, we're looking more at the passageways, all right? So the bronchial tree, remember, goes from the trachea, you have the bronchi, and then all the bronchioles. So when those passageways are irritated, by irritated, we mean they could be swollen, they could have fluid buildup, that really impedes air movement in and out. It's an obstructive type of disorder, so air can't go in and out, and you feel breathless, of course, and that would be heard a little differently than what you hear with pneumonia. There's more wheezing and coughing with asthma. And then finally, cancer, we know is when those cells are growing uncontrollably. Lung cancer, uncontrolled cell division in the lung is triggered because of a carcinogen that has triggered the cells to misbehave. uncontrolled cell division in the lung, and smoking, of course, is one of the main causes for lung cancer. The last thing we want to look at is some of the volumes that can be measured when we're trying to understand whether or not lung volume is normal, or whether or not the air that can come in and out has been somehow compromised. So over here, we see a patient who's undergoing something called a pulmonary function test. Pulmonary function test. How well do the lungs function? So this word vital capacity, vital for life, right? Your vital capacity, you can see here, is all of the air that you functionally can exhale. If you were to take the biggest breath you could, your vital capacity is all of the air that can be exhaled. And that vital capacity changes based on gender, your size, and of course, your health, your age, your really just ability to change your chest cavity to be able to bring in lots of air. So that's your vital capacity. We're going to compare that to something called the tidal volume. And those are really the main things we want to focus on here. Tidal volume, you can see this little girl, she's breathing here on a tube. She's got her nasal cavity closed off. So the breathing test is only happening here with what she can breathe in and what she can push out. So tidal volume is going to be the breath in and then the breath out. This is a normal amount of air you can breathe in and exhale in a restful breath. That's called your tidal volume. And for most of us, it's around 500 milliliters or half a liter. Again, vital capacity, if you take the biggest breath you can and then blow that out, you measure the vital capacity. And these things will change, again, based on now that we're understanding the effects of COVID-19, and clearly vital capacity and volumes of bringing air in and out have been compromised because of this disease. Here are the written definitions for those volumes. But again, tidal volume, that's the amount of air that moves in and out with each breath. So for most of it's about the same. It's about a half a liter with restful breathing. When we talk about vital capacity, the maximum amount of air that can be moved in, plus the maximum amount that you can exhale. So that whole volume, to measure it, you really take the biggest breath you can, blow out until you can't blow any more air out, and that's your vital capacity. So athletes will have higher vital capacities. Men versus women have higher vital capacities, usually because the lungs are larger. And of course, based on your health and the amount of exercise that you do and the amount of practice you have using your lungs to breathe in and breathe out, and really increase your vital capacity due to that. All right, some leftover air called residual volume would be increased if you don't have a very big vital capacity. You've got this trapped air. And so that's what residual volume is. If you add the two together, that's all the air that exists in your lungs. All right, so that's the end of chapter 10.